All right, well, welcome to the final event of the Saturday programming at the 2021 Iowa City Book Festival. My name is John Kenyon, and I'm the Executive Director of the Iowa City UNESCO City of Literature organization that runs the book festival. Before we get started with this final program, I did want to thank our sponsors who have helped to make this possible. Our festival is supported by the City of Iowa City, the University of Iowa, and Iowa Public Radio. I would also like to thank our partners at the Iowa City Public Library who have hosted our in-person portions of the programs, and our friends at Prairie Lights who have been selling books from our authors. So our guest for this session is Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, a historian, author, memoirist, and speaker who researches Western Hemisphere history and international human rights. She will discuss her new book, Not a Nation of Immigrants, Settler Colonialism, White Supremacy, and a History of Erasure and Exclusion. So Dr. Dunbar-Ortiz grew up in rural Oklahoma, the daughter of a tenant farmer. She's been active in the international indigenous movement for more than 4 decades, and she is known for her lifelong commitment to national and international social justice issues. After receiving her PhD in history at the University of California at Los Angeles, she taught in the newly established Native American Studies program at California State University, Hayward, and helped found the departments of Ethnic Studies and Women's Studies. She is the author of several books, including Red Dirt, Growing Up Okie, and An Indigenous Peoples History of the United States, which won the 2015 American Book Award. So welcome, Dr. Dunbar-Ortiz. And to begin, I would like to ask if you would read a passage from your book.
Thank you, John, and greetings to everyone. I'll read a brief excerpt from the introduction to the book. So it's called Not a Nation of Immigrants, Settler Colonialism, White Supremacy, and a History of Erasure and Exclusion. A Nation of Immigrants was a mid-20th century revisionist origin story of the United States. The country emerged from World War II undamaged by bombs and heavy population loss, which was the experience of most of the combatant nations. In fact, the United States became a beefed up industrial powerhouse, exhibiting military might, including the atomic bomb. It was poised to become the economic, military, and moral leader of the so-called free world. The country that actually defeated the army of the Third Reich, the Soviet Union, was the new adversary. US post-war administrations scrambled to conceal any trace of the United States colonialist roots or its system of slavery and continued segregation as they developed military and counterinsurgent strategies to quell national liberation movements in the former European colonies. The Soviet Union and Communist China, which took power in 1949, denounced Western imperialism and colonialism in Africa, Asia, Latin America, the Pacific, and the Caribbean, implicating the United States. The Cold War was launched. In 1958, then US Senator John F. Kennedy, surely informed by his guru historian, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., published the influential and best-selling book titled A Nation of Immigrants. He invented the term, which advanced the notion that the United States should be understood or defined through the diversity of the immigrants it had welcomed since independence. This thesis was embraced by US historians and found its way into textbooks and school curriculums and still rules today. It is neither coincidental nor surprising that Kennedy would introduce the idea, as at the time, he was strategizing how to become the first president born of immigrants, albeit very wealthy ones, and the first Catholic president in a Protestant-dominated culture. Aspiring to the presidency, Kennedy introduced a clear context and narrative in which he could transform this negative into a positive. This founding text of A Nation of Immigrants was published during Kennedy's 1954 to 1960 first term as US Senator from Massachusetts, 2 years before he was elected president. Given that in the 21st century, immigration is practically synonymous with the Mexico-US border that was established in 1848, it is striking that Kennedy in the book never mentions Mexico or Mexicans or the US-Mexico border in the text, nor did he use the terms Latino or Hispanic. Yet this was 1958, late in the period of the contract labor bracero program, which began during World War I. World War II. A total of 2 million Mexican citizens, with the participation of the Mexican government, migrated to the United States, particularly to California, as de facto indentured agricultural workers under time-limited contracts. Meanwhile, the burgeoning agribusiness industry in California recruited even more Mexican workers outside the program illegally, without documentation or civil rights, and subject to deportation. More egregious than Kennedy's omission of any mention of Mexico or the border or Mexicans is that the federal program, known by its offensive official name, Operation Wetback, began during Kennedy's first year as senator and continued beyond his senatorial career to his presidency. Operation Wetback began in 1954 to round up and deport more than 1 million Mexican migrant workers, mainly in California and Texas, in the process subjecting millions, many who were actually US citizens, to illegal search and detention and deportation, forcing them to forfeit their property. Workers were deported by air and trains and ships far from the border in the interior, leaving those who were US citizens stranded and without the documents enabling them to return to their homes in the United States. Operation Wetback was a repeat of the Hoover administration's deportation of 1 million Mexicans in the 1930s, dubbed Mexican repatriation. Regarding the status of Indigenous peoples in Kennedy's Nation of Immigrants scheme, the then senator wrote, quote, "Another way of indicating the importance of immigration to America is to point out that every American who ever lived, with the exception of one group, was either an immigrant himself or a descendant of immigrants," unquote. The exception, Kennedy went on, was, quote, Will Rogers, part Cherokee Indian, who said that his ancestors were at the docks to meet the Mayflower, unquote. But Kennedy disagreed, claiming that, quote, some anthropologists believe that the Indians themselves were immigrants from another continent who displaced the original settlers, the Aborigines. This is the bogus speculation of US white nationalists who claim that those imagined original Aborigines were in fact European, possibly Irish. A few pages on in the text, in the only other mention of Native Americans, Kennedy refers to them as the first immigrants, while dismissing their presence as members of scattered tribes. Equally unsettling, Kennedy includes enslaved Africans as immigrants, although the book contains the infamous drawing of a slave ship with humans chained down on their backs, scarcely an inch between each other, packed like sardines. It is striking to read how profoundly Kennedy whitewashed history by noting that, quote, the immigration experience was not always pleasant, unquote, or that the Japanese and Chinese brought their gentle dreams to the West Coast, unquote. He failed to mention the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1884, or its extension a few years later to all Asians, which still held at the time he was writing. The idea of the United States as a nation of immigrants was hatched in the late 1950s, and while Kennedy was its ambassador, it came to reflect the US ruling class response to the challenges of the post-World War II anti-colonial national liberation movements, as well as civil and human rights social movements domestically. Thanks.
All right, great. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. It sets a good bit of context for the book and our conversation here. I did want to say for folks who are watching this on Zoom, if you have questions that you would like us to pose to Dr. Dunbar-Ortiz during that portion of the program, please enter those in the Q&A box at the bottom, or you can also put them into the chat so we can see them. So I wanted to start off, if I could, by really getting deeper into that term, a nation of immigrants. And I will say I am young enough that Kennedy had already been killed by the time I came onto the scene. So for me, the term nation of immigrants, I saw it as a positive. It was like the melting pot. It was something that we were told as kids that we should be proud of our country. And so I was really interested to read about the genesis of that term. And I was struck by the fact that it was a term that was created to make us feel better about things that we shouldn't feel good about when it comes to immigration in our country. But even the same man and the same people who were espousing that, the policies that they were putting forth at that exact same time ran completely counter to what they should have been doing if they truly believed that. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, because you do delve into that in the book, that disconnect.
Yes, there's definitely a disconnect from anything that had happened in the past, including the fact that it was a state of settler colonialism. You know, really immigration did not begin until the Irish famine refugees came in the millions in the 1840s. And the first immigration law was the Chinese Exclusion Act in the 1880s. So immigration wasn't even on the agenda. It was a settler colonial state that had ethnically cleansed at least by 1860, had ethnically cleansed the continent and shoved Native people onto reservations, which remain today in that situation. So it's a colonial setting. It's not the colonists were colonizers, settlers. So it plays the role of camouflaging the reality of United States history. And then it creates a false image of how the United States has excluded, mainly exclusion. We see it today. I think they just announced the other day that 1.5 million people had been deported in the last year. And so exclusion is the rule. I have to say for Kennedy, though, is he had some sincerity in wanting to really look good in the world. There was this, this competition with the Soviet Union, which, had documentaries and, they were fighting on the radio waves and all of exposing the, bloodied demonstrators in the South, the Black civil rights movement, taking advantage, of course, of this history and telling, really the true history, and also about Native peoples. And of course, the United Nations had been established, and human rights was on the agenda, as was genocide. There were deep discussions in the Senate while Kennedy was president about not ratifying the Genocide Convention because Black people or Indians might take advantage of it. So they actually didn't ratify it until 1988, 40 years after its establishment, when every other country in the world had ratified it. So there was a lot of fear, but one thing Kennedy did is in trying to befriend the newly emerging, formerly colonized states in Africa and Asia and Latin America. Of course, he was involved in the planning that started in the mid-1950s for what came to be the invasion of Southeast Asia that really started, under his presidency. And but he did introduce or start drawing up legislation to present to Congress to open up immigration, to open up the quotas. There were very strict quotas on anyone who wasn't Western European to come to the United States. Practically everyone had to come illegally. So he opened it up to Asian and Latin American immigration. And he, of course, was assassinated in 1963. So the legislation actually passed under Lyndon Johnson in 1965, opening up immigration. And that's when we see, and it was partly for, really improving relations, sort of an escape valve for intellectuals in Africa. It was basically a brain drain and still is. So these poor countries, would educate their people and doctors and lawyers and technicians and all, and they would get scooped up, by the United States. And it's one reason that the third world has remained very poorly developed, among other things. So, but that legislation was introduced, but nevertheless, the deportations continued, especially at the border. This making migrant workers contingent, so they could be low paid, they could be exploited in agribusiness, and increasingly in meat packing, in Chicago and other places. And that just continues today. So when they need workers, they kind of open the illegal spout so they can come in. And then when they want to cap it, they start, rounding people up and deporting them. And that cycle just goes on and on.
I was going to say that sounds very familiar, particularly given what we heard earlier in this room today. Two books from folks talking about more specifically the meatpacking industry here in Iowa, and about the town of West Liberty, which is very much a hub for meatpacking and the folks who work in that industry. And it's interesting knowing that, that those practices continue. And it seems like as a country, we are going against our own self-interest. We need workers, and we do everything we can to try to marginalize those people who would be the workers, to take full advantage of them, but then not let them come in. And I'm thinking of our own governor here in Iowa, a Republican who has been going to the border with Mexico because of all of the problems that she cites there. At the same time, employers in our state don't have enough workers. And again, it's a real disconnect to the political posturing that takes place that goes against our own self-interest. And obviously that has deep roots.
It does. It really goes back to the founding. The first chapter in the book is titled Alexander Hamilton, who has gotten a tremendous brush up in the last few years. It's some kind of hero with the musical and all, but basically he led the fight to keep immigration out. It was during the French Revolution, and he was totally paranoid about French revolutionaries coming and stirring up trouble. And of course, then when the Haitian Revolution happened, terrified the slave owners. So it was Alexander Hamilton. The Alien and Sedition laws were very onerous. They really only allowed, up until the Irish came uninvited, not under immigration, but refugees arriving. Everyone who came was Anglo-Saxon, Scots-Irish, or German. That was it. No one else was really allowed. And so those were settlers. They were still taking land from Native people and bringing settlers from Europe too, because there were problems in Europe that were a factor in pushing people out. There were socialist movements in Germany where people were persecuted. Marx himself had to move to England, go into exile, and there were pogroms in Eastern Europe that many Jewish people escaped. And then, Catholic, Polish Catholics and Southern Italians immigrated in huge numbers without any barrier whatsoever to work in heavy industry. The Industrial Revolution in the Northeast. So including, in Chicago and the big cities of the Northeast. So it did become more diversified in terms of people who didn't speak English. Before that, of course, German, they actually discussed having German as a second language at independence because there were already quite a number of German settlers during the colonial period. And there were German language newspapers and all, but that was the end of diversity in language and immigration. So then you have Italians, you have very poor people too. These people who came as settlers were people of some means, that could become farmers. They were farmers in Germany, say, and they came with their already idea of getting a farm. Where I grew up in West Central Oklahoma, it was filled with German farmers and others, that came during the Oklahoma run. So it was only when the Irish came that they began to really get worried having all these Catholics on hand in a Protestant country. So I have a whole chapter on really how there's a book by Noah Lake native called How the Irish Became White. And what it really means is how the Irish became settlers, how they got Americanized. So this Americanization process that takes place, it's a really putting people through moves in order to be accepted as immigrants. They have to, like you then find Irish very quickly, even though there was a lot of abolitionism of slavery among Irish Republicans in colonized Ireland. When they came, one thing they could do, they started using blackface, and showing their anti-Black racism to be accepted. So that's kind of a bottom line of immigrants, is to adopt anti-Black racism.
I find it interesting you were talking about how even Kennedy would refer to Africans brought here in the slave trade as immigrants, or try to pass off indigenous people here as immigrants. And at the same time, then there were these movements to make the Irish or Italians, as you had mentioned, more native people. I just saw something on YouTube the other day. It was people who were at a Trump rally were referring to themselves as Irish Americans as natives because they had been here for enough generations. They considered themselves to be Native Americans. And it's an interesting flip there that's being done in the semantics of trying to say who belongs here and who doesn't.
Yeah, I deal with this, what I call self-indigenizing, particularly in Appalachia. The Scots-Irish predominantly settled in during the colonial period in the early 1700s, began coming, and there wasn't much land left, so they pushed into, illegally actually, pushed into Appalachia, which was deeply populated by Cherokee villages and farms, and really pushed people out, you know, settlers, settler militias, burning down villages, native villages, and burning the crops and then taking over. So they really consider themselves they don't pretend to be Native Americans, Indians, but they consider themselves as first settlers, you know, first settlers in Appalachia. And it's still a predominantly white Scots-Irish region. My father's family, the Dunbars, come from that heritage. So I kind of know about it through oral history as well. It used to be a positive thing. And until I learned the history. Although my dad used to say, "No, we're not Irish. We're called we're the bad ones." The bad Irish. He had that right.
Interesting. So you had mentioned him in passing, but I want to go back because I found it so interesting. You were talking about Alexander Hamilton, who has been really deified in the last 5 or 6 years because of this musical. And it was interesting because it feels like it's part of an ongoing practice, and it's probably not exclusive to Americans, but we seem to do it quite well, of deifying people from the past to make us feel better about our present. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that as it pertains to Hamilton and what Lin-Manuel Miranda was probably trying to say, and how people have embraced that, and how it runs so counter to the man himself.
Yeah, it's really why I decided to write the book, because I realized when just reading about this in this blockbuster, this phenomenon, you know, and it inaugurated in the White House, Obama's White House, Lin-Manuel having the performance there, and it just soared, and that it's the epitome of the Nation of Immigrants myth, because they actually turn Alexander Hamilton, a white citizen of a British colony, into an immigrant. They call him an immigrant. And of course, an orphan and poor. And of course, it completely distorts Caribbean history. Very small minority of white people. It was predominantly Black slaves and managers. But every white person was a citizen of the British Empire. So when he relocated, or when he was sent, some wealthy people took him in, and then they sent him to Columbia University, which was called, at that time it was called Saint, I don't remember what it was called, but it was the only university. There were none in the Caribbean. So it was like someone today going from where I am in California to NYU or to Columbia University is going from one colony to the other. They were free to travel, you know, and they did. The Barbados slavers Many of them moved up and founded the colony of South Carolina in the late 1600s. So that's a complete distortion, that's what an immigrant is. And then on top of that, the person making the play, Lin-Manuel Miranda, is Puerto Rican, which is a colony. Puerto Rico is a colony of the United States. He's not an immigrant. He's a colonized person who has been given the right to come without, they're semi-citizens. So he doesn't have to have papers, to move to the stateside. And so that too then and so he then imagines that his father, who left Puerto Rico, Lin-Manuel was born in New York, to have a better life, that his father, that he claimed, Alexander Hamilton was like his father, leaving the Caribbean and coming to New York as an immigrant. So it's so distorted that it's, but it is this celebration of, a nation of immigrants. There's the, when he and the French royal are, on horseback and Alexander Hamilton and the young French baron, we immigrants get the job done. And of course, this French royal was there he was like 20 years old, and he was there for the fight and went home and never had a even single moment of thinking he would stay in the United States. And Hamilton, so again, even making that person an immigrant. So it is, and completely erases settler colonialism and the situation in, the period of the War of Independence.
So I find it interesting that so much of your work is about debunking myths, commonly held myths about our history. And I wonder if you've given thought to this, that I would imagine that your job is significantly more difficult because what you are trying to debunk is so entrenched. It's what people have been taught from the moment that they heard about history. And so you're not only trying to educate people about what really happened and what really took place, but also to dislodge things that they hold to be not only the truth, but they hold quite dear. And what does that mean for you and the work that you're doing?
Yeah, and of course, I was raised with all of these myths, becoming a historian, first of Latin America. I think in that way, I found US history books extremely boring. And I did not like my US history classes I took as an undergraduate. They were just boring. And I think I couldn't put my finger on it, but I think it was because it was, I sensed that they weren't telling the truth, but, I didn't know the truth myself. But once I started doing Latin American history, I started seeing the United States as Latin Americans see the United States. And it looks quite different, when you're looking from below, like in Mexico, they say, poor Mexico, so far from God, so close to the United States, that it's, it's oppressive because they've been, under the foot of US imperialism since their independence. And of course, they took half of Mexico in a war, 2-year war in 1846-48. So I think that gave me a different view, but I certainly didn't really want to do US history. It wasn't my objective. But as I got involved in the late 60s, there was this, I was a teaching assistant at UCLA for Ronald Takaki, who's a Japanese Hawaiian historian who specialized in Black history and was hired to teach the first Black history course at UCLA. And I volunteered to be his TA. He got fired after a year for being too radical and attracting Black people, young Black people from South Central LA started coming over to the class, and he welcomed them. They weren't enrolled. A professor at a UC university in California is supposed to have complete academic freedom to do anything they want practically in the classroom. But he didn't get, as universities work, he didn't get fired, he didn't get continued. You're always probationary the first year. So he was gone, but he certainly put into my brain this idea of ethnic studies, because he went up to University of California, Berkeley, and set up the first department of ethnic studies, Asian, Black, Native American, and Mexican American, Chicano. So that inspired me. So when I went out after I finished my dissertation, I decided to teach in ethnic studies so I could develop curriculum and come at it that way, come at US history that way and try to change it. And I think that's why we do have changes in interpretations of US history, is the ethnic studies, have come to be really respected departments. They started mainly in California, but they now exist all over the country. And this then gave new perspectives, and US historians had to start trying to catch up with it. They haven't caught up all that well, but many have. It's not a very friendly place still, history departments for people of color who want to actually do, history in a different way. It's still not very friendly in most universities, but it's changing, and it has changed with young historians, young Anglo historians definitely are doing some amazing work these days.
So that's an interesting segue. And while I was doing some research for today, I found an article that you had written 15 years ago in the Monthly Review that had the headline, "Stop Saying This is a Nation of Immigrants." So I know you've been working on this work for at least 15 years, probably longer. So how has your view of that changed or evolved over that time, or has it? Or is it more just a refinement of beliefs and thoughts that you had back then that you still hold today?
Yeah, that was back when we were doing blogs, and I called it a rant. It's just a rant, Native Americans aren't immigrants, and enslaved Africans aren't immigrants. Mexicans aren't really immigrants, if they're in their own country when they cross the border, what was their country? And so it's just, a rant like that. I had no intention of writing a book on it, even though we used to say these things went viral before social media somehow, and I don't really remember how, but things would just really spread, throughout the internet. And that was one of those things that, just got around to everywhere. And everywhere I go, people hear my name. "Oh, you wrote that thing about immigrants, didn't you?" So, yeah, and I always included it in books and mentioned it. But it was only when my editor, my previous book, An Indigenous Peoples History of the United States, it was published in 2014 at Beacon Press. My editor, who herself is an immigrant from India, her family came when she was 9 years old. I had a little paragraph in that book debunking the Nation of Immigrants, just a short paragraph that it's a settler colonial state and immigration didn't begin. And she said, can you make a book out of this? So I said, I hadn't really thought of doing that, honestly. I don't know why. It seemed like a natural because I got so upset about the musical. I did go see it, the Alexander Hamilton musical. It was a miserable experience because people are in rapture, young people in rapture over this musical. And I was squirming, but I took notes, and then I read the whole thing through and everything. So I was going to, center it on that, but it became much more. I had the contract for, I think in 2017, and I was traveling a lot still with the other book. I'm retired from teaching, but it seems like I was working more than I did from teaching because I got invited to lecture at universities a lot and was traveling all over the country. And I love teaching. So it was a way of teaching without grading papers, which is really nice. And just getting responses. It was very fulfilling. I really enjoy it. Of course, it's been 2 years now since I've done that, but I never got down. I did research. I made the outline, the book proposal, 30 pages. And so I was ready to go, but I kept delaying it. And then the shutdown last year, I have no excuse now. And I have a September deadline because my editor moved up the deadline a couple of times. And so I wrote it last year. Fortunately, I'd done most of the research, so I couldn't go to libraries or anything. But I did find, to my pleasure, that there's an amazing amount of archives on the internet now. So I was able to do further research because as I was writing, I would get new ideas, things I wanted to look into that I hadn't plotted out and planned, but especially about Columbus, have ended up with a 40-page chapter on Columbus.
Well, I certainly have a few other questions, but I wanted to just remind folks watching on Zoom, if they have questions, they can drop them into the chat. Any questions here? We do have one. While we're getting that, I'll ask one more question here. So you talked about getting the contract in 2017 and now the book is coming out. Obviously, it was a very tumultuous time in our country, particularly related to immigration there and related to the White House and its relation to immigration. What did all of that do just for immigration in general, if we've moved beyond it at all enough to have a long view of what these last 4 years were like, and what impact did that have on your work and your research?
Yeah, it was, of course, from the very beginning of the Trump administration. You remember the banning of Muslims, the sealing of the border, refusing any asylum seekers, and the draconian, it's not Trump, actually. Obama deported many more people than Trump did in reality, but the rhetoric was, usually there's this double thing. We're a nation of immigrants, and Obama always said, he was one of them. His father was an immigrant, and that it's a hypocrisy. So Trump just came out with it. His rhetoric was the same as his behavior. Actually, his actual actions and of immigration were not that much different than every administration before him and the one that exists now. It's a fraught area. I don't know really how to do with it because there's, despite this Nation of Immigrants rhetoric and pride, there's such an anti-immigrant culture in the United States that starts from the very beginning, the suspicion of foreigners, the Alien and Sedition Acts. So it's so deep in the culture, and especially in the for the descendants of settlers, like my father's family, have this sense of being the first people, the original people, and that they should not. So at the same time, there are these labor needs and this needs for immigrants, also the slowing of the birth rate in the United States and Europe. So it's a conundrum, for how to deal with immigration, how to let the right number of people in and then, kick them out at a certain point. So it's pretty draconian. It's similar, to Europe as well, but I think the anti-immigration sentiment is a product of colonialism, I think, in the West.
Okay, we've got a question from someone here in the audience. So.
Well, I'm interested in your role as a debunker of origin myths and the whole brouhaha about critical race theory. I'm using air quotes. They're passing laws, I know, here in Iowa, against teaching critical race theory. And in order to get around the idea that they can't actually say this didn't happen, they're saying that the teachers are not allowed to teach anything that will make people feel bad. So I'm just interested in what your take on this whole mess is.
Yes, thank you for that question. It's very apropos. My home state of Oklahoma has a draconian denial of anything that makes the student feel bad. But of course, those of us who are educators know, and I know from my own experience being a student, learning the truth, that there's something so liberating about it. You don't feel bad. I mean, unless you're, I don't know of any teacher that tries to make their students feel bad. But the idea that critical race theory, which is a rather arcane, legalistic doctrine that developed, is actually the opposite of making people feel bad, because in fact, it's been criticized some because it insists on it being totally structural. It has nothing to do with prejudice, and those things are secondary reactions to the structures that are built into all of the institutions of the United States, based mainly on slavery and what it produced in terms of white supremacy. That's still very strong. So it doesn't at all put the onus on the person. It's structural, but I think that's actually what they're afraid of. That then questions even the Constitution. It questions every single institution has to be looked at in terms of how, like immigration. Why was immigration not a problem as long as only Germans were coming as settlers? And then it was more or less okay when they got used to the Irish, they spoke English, they blue-eyed blondes mostly, so no problem. So it really is, a colonized and white supremacy that is associated with it. So it certainly does not make children uncomfortable. I don't really haven't had that experience myself. My book, An Indigenous Peoples History of the United States, is a terrible indictment, of the United States. But I make sure that that it's understood that it is structural, that it's not individuals being bad people, because we can only be what we know. We're raised with this structure of white supremacy. So it doesn't go away naturally. And great strides have been made in tolerance and integration, but much is left to be done, and a lot of things are going backwards now.
Great, thank you. I've got another question here from the audience.
Hi, Roxanne. My question has to do with my first exposure to Native American, real exposure to Native American culture was powwow. I felt from the beginning that I was present in a community of people, and I felt welcome, at ease in that community, seeing the kids running around and seeing the elderly people sitting in chairs. I mean, it was just so human, and the Native people themselves kind of were very welcoming. You could invited to come down and dance in the intertribals. All our non-Indian people are welcome. I guess I wanted to sort of pose that to you as an example of a really strong outreach, I think, a bridge, an attempt to develop a really friendly bridge between two cultures, one non-immigrant and one immigrant.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That maintenance of community and collectivism. All at any Native event, all generations are there. From the babies to very elderly. It's not complete, without that. And usually there's food and festivity and a lot of joy, despite the horrors, of genocide and the reduction of, from 100 million people to only, about 5 million now. It's growing somewhat. It was down to less than 1 million at the end of the 19th century. So there's still awful conditions on reservations and land bases that, land claims, land back is the main slogan of Native activists now. And I think there's a lot more understanding, especially since Standing Rock. Well, we had the Wounded Knee occupation back in 1973. So that generation got to know Native people, but it sort of waned. And then Standing Rock, once again, brought worldwide attention and huge numbers of people who went there in the middle of the winter to support, non-Native and Native people from all over the country. And now we have in Minnesota the Enbridge protests. So here and in Canada, I think all over the hemisphere, there's a real renaissance of Native cultures and Native communities and movements, even at the international level. There's a declaration on the rights of Indigenous peoples that the United Nations did in 2007. So there's been a Native lobby at the United Nations since 1977. I worked with that, and it's just, it really is, I think people feel a little bit intimidated by Native people, that they don't know how to deal with it. There's a lot of guilt, but it's like, you just go to a powwow, everyone is welcome, and really see the difference that, and powwows take place in every city. It's like this sort of underground. Also basketball, Native basketball teams. There are many ways to participate and get to know Native American centers. And of course, Native American studies in colleges. Now here in California, we have an actual legislation to that ethnic studies has to be taught in high schools, public high schools in California now.
Great. Well, I had one more question. We're getting to the top of our hour here, so we'll have to let you go. But obviously, there's always something about immigration in the news, and this brought to mind what we've been dealing with here just in the last couple of months. It's a quote that you put into the conclusion from Suketa Mehta from This Land is Our Land, an Immigrant's Manifesto. You say, you quote this writer, "When migrants move, it's not out of idle fancy or because they hate their homeland or to plunder the countries they come to, or even most often to strike it rich. They move, as my grandfather knew, because the accumulated burdens of history have rendered their homelands less and less habitable." And when I read that, I was immediately made to think of Afghanistan and again, the complete disconnect between us wanting to get out of there, wanting to stay, wanting those people to come, not wanting those people to come. It feels like we can never figure out what side of these things we are on as a country. And I wondered what you thought about as you saw what was happening there and what continues to unfold with that situation.
Yeah, I really love that book, Mehta's book. He also says, we are here because you were there.
Yes.
And I think that, but the thing that impressed me about his book is his knowledge of US history, and that the care that immigrants need to take because of the native land base and you know, the original people, that really all these people who are here that aren't native came from somewhere else. So I do think a lot of these, there are quite a few of these wonderful books from either children of like him, of third world immigrants, or themselves immigrants. There's a Moroccan woman who's written a memoir that of how, as a Muslim, she's treated. So I think that there is a consciousness that immigrants in the past didn't have access to because they weren't asked to, and the native people were so suppressed. But now there are hundreds, if not thousands, of native scholars at Harvard and Yale and all of the universities throughout the country. They're not really enough to go around but many more are in the pipeline, young students studying, many native lawyers and spokespeople, you know, who have a higher profile. So I think it really is helpful to new immigrants to be able to understand history as Native people see it. It's a truer history of the United States.
Great. Well, thank you very much. This brings us to the end of our time. So I would really like to thank you very much for joining us today. It has been a fascinating conversation. It's a wonderful book, and I hope everyone has the chance to read it. So again, thank you very much to Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz for joining us at the Iowa City Book Festival today.
Thank you so much.
Great. Well, thank you.